This is my most humbling video yet. Not only the material we're about to cover, but how it all came to be. After every video I create, I wonder what will be next. I've left the YouTube journey open to my depths, myself, to provide the content to create. So the day after releasing the video on the red one, I sat back and wondered, how long will the next project take? Will it be black or red? As usual, my judgments are pathetic at best. Then, suddenly, a voice said, go back to the first ancient Greek philosopher. I start with Parmenides, then to his teacher, Xenophanes, through Pythagoras, Anaximenes, and Anaximander. Finally, I arrive at Thales of Miletus. Interesting. Next, I read this sentence. According to Aristotle, Thales was the first to suggest a single material substratum for the universe, namely water or moisture. This is rather interesting, and will come into play throughout this video, so see if you can catch this. But the text continues, again according to Aristotle. Thales also held that all things are full of gods, and that magnetic objects possess souls by virtue of their capacity to move iron. Instantly, I remembered the section in Aion where Jung discusses this fish that the alchemists were fascinated by, the Echeneis, because of its ability to attract to a vessel and cause it to come to a standstill, a reference to the ego and self relationship. I'm starting to see where I'm being led. Of course, as we will come to see, Jung mentions Thales of Miletus in this chapter, but this will not be a Greek philosophical take on Thales, as it originally seemed. Rather, we will take a deep dive into a chapter in Aion where this specific magnetic reference is found. So sit back and enjoy our quest to grasp Jung's teachings on psychological magnetism, say our own law of self-attraction, as we seek to gain a full perspective of this chapter titled, The Alchemical Interpretation of the Fish. Aion is a book that one must devote time and attention to in order to truly appreciate it, to truly grasp it. I thought about doing an entire series on this book in the past, but then I realized its depth. You will realize it as we explore this one chapter of just under 20 pages. It has so much depth, it may as well have been made into an entire series itself. For this video, I will be focusing in on this one idea of attracting the self and beginning the alchemical art, a reference to Jung's Individuation, as well as connect the ideas by Thales which led this video to become. With that said, let's begin with a quick recap leading up to Chapter 11 in Aion. Jung begins with the ego, your consciousness. First and foremost, there is an ego, an I, a will and experiencing subjective vessel that is a part of the whole process. Then he follows with all that the ego cannot grasp, the shadow, the first layer of one's personal unconscious. As we continue into deeper layers of the personal unconscious, the next chapter features the syzygy, Jung's anima and animus. The entire psyche as one is the self, which is the feature of the next chapter. He then links the self and Christ in chapter 5, and in chapter 6 he links Christ to fish symbolism. In chapter 7 he takes an interesting prophetic interlude, and then dives back into the history, ambivalence, and alchemy of the fish in chapters 8, 9, and 10. And through the entire psyche, from ego to self, Christ, and the fish, we arrive at chapter 11. I want to begin with an alchemical text found in the previous chapter. This is the text Jung revisits in chapter 11, the basis of this video, and when we conclude, you will have a new understanding of its symbolic meaning. For that which we take, in order to prepare from it the philosophical work, is naught else but that little fish, the Echeneis, which has no blood or spiny bones, and is shut up in that deep mid-region of the great universal sea. This little fish is extremely small, alone, and unique in its shape. But the sea is great and vast, and hence it is impossible for those to catch it who do not know in what part of the world it dwells. Believe me verily, that he who, as Theophrastus says, does not well understand the art by which he can draw down the moon from the sky and bring it from heaven to earth, and change it into water and then into earth, will never find the material of the stone of the wise, for it is not more difficult to perform the one than to find the other. Yet, nonetheless, when we speak somewhat in confidence in the ear of a trusted friend, we teach him that hidden secret of the wise, how he can naturally, speedily, and easily catch the little fish called remora, which is able to hold back the proud vessels of the great ocean sea, that is the spirit of the world. Those who are not sons of the art are altogether ignorant, and know not those precious treasures which are concealed by nature in the precious and heavenly aquavitae of our sea. But that I may declare to you the clear light of our unique material, or our virgin soil, and teach you in what wise you may acquire the supreme art of the sons of wisdom, it is needful that I instruct you concerning the magnet of the wise, which has the power of attracting the little fish called Echeneis, or remora, from out the center and depth of the sea. If it is caught in accordance with nature, it changes in a natural way, first into water and then into earth. And this, when properly prepared by the cunning secret of the wise, has the power of dissolving all solid bodies and making them volatile, and of purifying all bodies that are poisoned. Jung begins chapter 11. We shall now turn to the problem raised by the anonymous French author of the Instructio de Arbore Solari, the problem of how one can catch the fish. After this, Jung provides an important example of the fish. He says, the Echeneis exercises an attraction on ships that can be compared with the influence of a magnet on iron. The attraction emanates from the fish and brings the vessel, whether powered by sail or oarsmen, to a standstill. To help understand this quote, I must add a quote from the previous chapter on the Echeneis fish. Our interpretation of the round fish as the self can be extended to the Echeneis. The symbol of the self appears here as an extremely small fish in the vast ocean of the unconscious, like a man alone on the sea of the world. To bring these quotes together, in the vast ocean or the unconscious, the fish or the self has the power to bring the vessel or ego consciousness to a standstill. One may be confused, though, as this does not explain catching the fish. How can one magnetize consciousness, their ego, if it is the self, something outside one's own will, that is doing all the attracting? Jung answers, I mention this seemingly unimportant feature because, as we shall see, in the alchemical view, the attraction no longer proceeds from the fish, but from a magnet which man possesses, and which exerts the attraction that was once the mysterious property of the fish. Quickly, I'll add a note on Jung's writing. As I like to say, you must watch each and every one of his words. If you read too quickly, you'll miss them. If you read with some focus, though, you'll catch his hints, as the one we just noticed. He writes, this seemingly unimportant feature, in which the word seemingly can be quickly overlooked. Seemingly unimportant means it is important. Hence, he mentions this to allude to the ego being unaware or inflated from the self. In addition, notice his mention of how the vessel moves. One is by sail and the other by oarsmen, alluding to two different states of the ego, which is either unconscious on the surface or inflated on the surface. Both egos are truly unaware of reality, the self, the true grounds on which it lies. The seemingly unimportant example is rather important, referring to something more powerful within that will bring life to a standstill. He then continues, It is therefore a remarkable innovation when the alchemist set out to manipulate an instrument that would exert the same powers as the Echeneis, but on the Echeneis itself. He has, so to speak, inveigled the secret out of the fish and seeks to draw the arcane substance to the surface in order to prepare from it the Thales Philosophorum, the lapis. This gives us a key insight to Jung's fascination with alchemy. The alchemist realized the significance not only of the self, but also the individual, the subject, the ego, which may manipulate an instrument to attract the self. This instrument symbolized as a magnet. Additionally, we are getting an idea of the creation of the philosopher's stone or individuation process. The adept, you, must attract the secret out of the fish and use it to draw the arcane substance to the surface in order to prepare from it the philosopher's stone or the self. And in this, you see, catching the fish originally is an idea of self-awakening. As one should know, the self doesn't completely awaken and know all. It is a process of re-remembering, as one could say. And its source of consciousness, its food, is in the arcane substance. Before diving deeper into the magnet and this arcane substance, I want to provide a few illustrations. Our first image is where the vessel is brought to a standstill by the fish. The arcane, a part of the self, stops the ego in its tracks. This may be any possessive or instinctive psychic situation. If one remains unaware of its source, it will continue blinded on the surface. The second illustration is this alchemical reversal, where one may manipulate the instrument, the magnet, to attract the fish to the surface to apply its substance to the stone or oneself for conscious expansion. The final image is our alchemical formula. There is first an attraction, then an extraction, and then a reunion. You see, it's a three-step process. First, an attraction brings the fish or content to light. Next, the extraction separates its image from the moisture or essence. And then finally, that moisture is integrated into the stone. The stone being the final goal, the lapis philosophorum. The magnet of the wise. Jung comments on this magnet. The magnet of the wise, which is to draw the wonder-working fish to the surface, can be taught. The content of this secret teaching is the real arcanum of alchemy, the discovery or production of the prima materia. On this prima materia, Jung notes, the names given to the prima materia show that it was not a definite substance at all, but rather an intuitive concept for an initial psychic situation, symbolized by such terms as water of life, cloud, heaven, shadow, sea, mother, moon, dragon, Venus, chaos, massa confusa, microcosmos, etc. So we've learned one can be taught how to create this magnet of the wise, and the content of this teaching is the knowledge of how to find or produce the prima materia, or in psychological terms, an initial psychic situation. The word initial or prima represents the psychic content uncorrupted by our own opinions or beliefs. Again, it is the initial psychic situation. For example, we may have many complexes and reflexes built upon one initial psychic event, and this event was built up on prior knowledge to the event. Hence, it's built up on an archetype. If one is focused on the symptoms, without discovering or producing the initial situation that caused the symptoms to then occur, it is not the prima or initial psychic situation that's being healed. Another example of an initial psychic situation is an unconscious projection. If one does not repress or project it, and rather reflects upon it, then you could see how one may catch or discover the prima. And while one may have short-term ego relief from handling surface symptoms, or projecting or rejecting what's coming through, it is the depths in oneself that is still affected by the initial situation. So this magnet of the wise will then attract the self to the surface for healing and transformation. Continuing on this prima materia, Jung provides one specific example. He writes, "Magnesia is rather the complete or co-joined mixture from which this moisture is extracted, the root matter of our stone. This example of magnesia will be our focus on this lecture, but remember it's not a chemical, but rather the alchemical magnesia, and it's also one of many names for the prima materia." Jung continues, "The magnesia is feminine, just as the magnet is masculine by nature. Hence it carries in its belly the sol harmonicum et vegetabile, meaning the arcane substance of the stone. In the belly of the complete mixture, the magnesia, lies the arcane substance of the stone. This is the root matter of the stone, which is to be integrated with the Thales Philosophorum. Also note the substance is called arcane, which is of the same root as archetype. The substance or moisture can be said to be that of an archetype." Jung continues with an alchemical recipe by Johannes Rosinus. "Therefore take this animated stone, the stone which has a soul in it, the mercurial, which is sensible and sensitive to the presence and influence of the magnesia and the magnet, and which is the calaminary and the living stone, yielding and repelling by local motion. Notice this living stone, that is the lapis, is sensible and sensitive to the relation of the magnet and magnesia. Sensible is related to knowing or intelligence, and sensitive could be related to feelings or desire. Hence it has a vitality to it, since it is rooted in both intelligence and force." On this animated stone, Jung continues, "The lapis animalis, animated stone, of Rosinus, then is a live thing, credited with the ability to feel or perceive the influence of the magnesia and the magnet. But the magnet, too, is a live thing. Thus, the jurisconsult and alchemist Chrysippus Phanianus of Basel says, if Thales of Miletus chose to call that stone of Hercules, the magnet, the animated thing, because we see it attract and move iron, why shall we not likewise call salt, which in wondrous wise penetrates, purges, contracts, expands, hinders, and reduces a living thing? This brings us to the point which brought me to this section in Aion and creation of the video. It was Thales who spoke about magnets having souls in them because of their power to move iron. I was unaware he was in this chapter when initially rereading it, although I am surprised he was not further discussed. As we come to see, his ideas continue to weave itself throughout the background of this chapter. Jung continues on the vitality of the magnet. The magnet, too, had a soul, like the mysterious stone that can feel. In the Dodecium Tractatus, the magnet appears as the symbol of the aqua auris nostri, water of our dew, whose mother is the midpoint of the heavenly and earthly sun and moon. The underlying thought here is the idea of the doctrine, the aqua doctrinae. As we have seen, the magnet or the heavenly dew can be taught. Like the water, it symbolizes the doctrine itself. Our magnet of the wise, we have come to learn, symbolizes the doctrine itself, the aqua doctrinae. The soul of the aqua doctrinae, the soul in the magnet, Jung refers to as the aqua permanence. On this aqua permanence, Jung writes in the archetypes and the collective unconscious, this water is extolled as vivifying, besides which it has the property of dissolving all solids and coagulating all liquids. This vivifying is the aliveness which gives the magnet its attractive effect, and the stone its animation. It also alludes to our initial alchemical text, where the moon is attracted and dissolved into water and then coagulated into earth. The dissolving will be the separation of the image and essence, and coagulation is the union of essence to essence. If anyone is familiar with the ancient philosopher of Sicily, Empedocles, you will see his two cosmic powers at play here, that of strife and love. On the idea of integrating essence to essence, Jung adds, The animated stone, like the magnet, is an arcane substance, and only such substances can enter into a combination, finally leading to the goal of the lapis philosophorum. Just as Magnus and Magnesia form a pair, so the lapis animatus sive vegetabalis is a rebus, or hermaphrodite, that is born of the royal marriage. We have then two contrasting pairs, forming by mutual attraction a quaternio, the fourfold basis of wholeness. As the symbolism shows, the pairs both signify the same thing, a complexium oppositorum, or uniting symbol. Here everything comes together. We see the masculine magnet and feminine magnesia forming a pair, and the stone, which is the self or the divine child for anyone who's watched my Red Book series, and its own masculine and feminine nature, uniting to create a quaternio, symbolizing wholeness and the essence of individuation. On this likeness of essence that brings it all together, Jung adds in the previous chapter, Parmenides says the same thing as Echeneis in the Turba. Nature is not improved saved through its own nature. And Bernardus adds by way of confirmation, thus our material cannot be improved saved through itself. It was the theory of Parmenides that helped Bernardus on the right track after much fruitless laboratory work, and there is a legend that he even succeeded in making the Philosopher's Stone. There is this likeness of the same substance, the arcane, which is found in each of the three of our examples. You see how it could be difficult to grasp what is occurring, but with some focus, it could be caught. The prima materia is the main focus of everything. Prima is the initial. In Latin, it means first. And what is first is one. It is all from one transcendental source. The magnet of the wise is the doctrine of the one. The magnesia is an experience trapped in matter arising from an archetype from which the substance of the one is trapped. The philosopher's stone, or self, is one. Now more on this one will come into play shortly, but Jung now takes a look at the soul in the magnet of the wise, the aqua doctrinae. The center of this magnet contains a hidden salt, a menstruum for calcinizing the philosophical gold. Whenever an alchemist speaks of salt, he does not mean sodium chloride or any other salt, or only in a very limited sense. He cannot get away from its symbolic significance, and therefore included the sal sapiente in the chemical substance. That is the hidden salt in the magnet, and prepared by the adept. On one hand, a product of his own art. On the other, already presented in nature. This contradiction can be resolved very easily by taking it simply as the projection of a psychic content. This salt alludes to someone's own knowledge, someone's own belief system. If someone's salt is distorted, it will not attract the arcane or what is needed to the adept. Rather, it would attract its own illusions. If one's art is not in balance with nature, not working with its likeness, it will never reach the root matter in things. This true hidden salt in the center of the magnet of the wise is also connected to truth. As Jung adds, a similar state of affairs can be found in Doran's writing. In his case, it is not a question of the sal sapiente, but of the veritas, which for him is hidden in natural things and at the same time is obviously a moral concept. This truth is the medicine, improving and transforming that which is no longer into that which it was before its corruption, and that which is not into that which it ought to be. It's a metaphysical substance, hidden not only in things, but in the human body. In the human body is concealed a certain metaphysical substance known to few, which needeth no medicament, being itself an incorrupt medicament. Now before we get to a climax in this chapter, which brings everything together, I want to bring in Thales. His first quote that I was attracted to read, according to Aristotle, Thales was the first to suggest a single material substratum for the universe, namely water or moisture. If anyone searches a YouTube video on Thales, you will hear something along the lines of, "Oh, wait till you hear this. This philosopher thought everything is made from water." And with that true lack of depth, they're stuck on the symbol and unable to contemplate its essence. When one now grasps this moisture that we have seen like a chameleon in the center of the magnet, in the center of the magnesia, and in the center of the lapis, with a vitality, an intelligence, and a force, one could begin to grasp the nature of the self, and in that, gain a true appreciation for an ancient philosopher in the 6th century BC. There is something of its nature in everything, in every thought, in every dream, in every feeling, in every projection. And if one doesn't have this hidden salt, this veritas, this truth, then the essence will never be known. The best analogy to understand this is a trauma. For that trauma to live in the unconscious, it must have a part of you trapped in it. The truth in the matter will help free it back to its source and heal the trauma, while at the same time expanding consciousness. This is just one of unlimited examples of how this may be psychologically applied. Now in this chapter, there's a footnote where Jung talks about this divine nature of moisture. He writes, "The extraordinary importance of water in alchemy goes back, in my view, to Gnostic sources, and water is honored, and they believed it is as if it were a god, going almost as far as to allege that life arises therefrom." And when you take that quote and compare it to what Aristotle said about Thales, I have a bit of a dilemma with Jung. Thales brought me here with moisture and attraction, an ancient Greek philosopher 600 years before the Gnostics, yet Jung seems to want to connect the alchemists with the Gnostics. I have nothing against Gnostics, but this connection runs hundreds of years before. And with that said, it's not as if he's trying to hide the ancient philosophers, as it refers to Parmenides and Thales. He even brought back Thales once more in Aion, in the chapter of the Gnostic symbols of the self, where he states, "Thales of Miletus, who said water was the prime substance of which all life depends." Why Jung seems to provide an afterthought to the original thinking of this material is rather puzzling. As I continue to explore and unpack these ancient Greek philosophers, I notice their roots throughout all of Jung's work, and throughout most of Western culture. And they were not the philosophers that we're taught about today. There's a true spirituality found in each of the philosophers' work. And it's a spirituality also found in Jungian individuation. Now, the only quote I could find to explain this is from Sanu Shamdasani. He wrote, "Jung had little connection to the Greek dramas, and even Plato didn't speak to him." Now, if I'm going to make any opinion, any judgment, I'm going to say maybe Jung didn't have the correct translations to Plato and wasn't able to see the spiritual side to it. And it's not just Jung who's having a difficulty with the spiritual side to the Platonists and to the early Greeks. Even Nietzsche struggled with people like Socrates. For anyone interested, I'm going to add in the link a translation to some of Plato's works that picks up the self in its translation. While they can be difficult to read, if not more difficult than Jung, it will provide a whole new appreciation and awareness of this material. I'm sure I'll create content on this in the future. Now, after a much-needed interlude, let's get back into Aion. We have been focused on this veritas, or truth, that is in the center of the magnet. Interestingly enough, Jung adds, "He that would acquire the chemical art must study the true philosophy, and not the Aristotelian," adds Dorn, because the true doctrine in Collison's work is the magnet whereby the center of truth is liberated from bodies and where the bodies are transformed. There is a magnet with the ego's salt, opinions, beliefs, perceptions, and then there's another magnet, in the salt of the wise, which is, one could say, divine truth. And what's so beautiful about this truth is it's a universal truth, which means it's true to me, it's true to you, and it's true to everybody else watching this video. A one truth. Following this, Jung provides a climax for this chapter. It is jam-packed, so I will read it verbatim and follow with commentary. Thus, the doctrine, which may be consciously acquired through a kind of divine inspiration, is at the same time the instrument whereby the object of the doctrine or theory can be freed from its imprisonment in the body, because the symbol for the doctrine, the magnet, is at the same time the mysterious truth of which the doctrine speaks. The doctrine enters consciousness of the adept as a gift of the Holy Ghost. It is a thesaurus of knowledge about the secret of the art, of the treasure hidden in the prima materia, which was thought to be outside man. The treasure of the doctrine and the precious secret concealed in the darkness of matter are one and the same thing. For us, this is not a discovery, as we have known for some time that such secrets owe their existence to unconscious projections. Dorn was the first thinker to recognize with the utmost clarity the extraordinary dilemma of alchemy. The arcane substance is one and the same whether it is found within man or outside him. The alchemical procedure takes place within and without. He who does not understand how to free the truth in his own soul from its fetters will never make a success out of the physical opus, and he who knows how to make the stone can only do so on the basis of right doctrine, through which he himself is transformed, and which he creates through his own transformation. One key takeaway here is that the doctrine enters consciousness through a kind of divine inspiration, which Jung labels the Holy Ghost, or one could say the Logos, which is at the same time the instrument of which will free the soul trapped in matter. It's not the ego doing any work, but rather allowing it to take place, allowing the experience to occur. In this, the ego must have an awareness of the other, be open to it, and allow its divine inspiration to come through. Jung says it was thought to be outside man, but if there is a higher intelligence in one's unconscious, one can see how the truth is within all. And it is this truth that is trapped in an initial psychic situation, which is to be freed, which is why the arcane substance is both within and without. Additionally, one must free one's own soul before ever making the lapis philosophorum, as one can never allow something to enter if it believes it is the ruler of the house. And if one does free their soul, the lapis then must be created through the right doctrine, again, which is of its own essence. As you see, everything starts with oneself, and everything is bound by this one arcane substance. On this note, Jung adds, helped by these reflections, Dorn comes to realize the fundamental importance of self-knowledge. See, therefore, that thou goest forth such as thou desirest the work to be which thou seekest. In other words, the expectations you put into the work must be applied to your own ego. The production of the arcane substance is possible only for one who has full knowledge of the doctrine. The doctrine formulates our inner experience, or is substantially dependent on it. This again alludes to the ego being a part of the experience and consciously growing along with it. In addition, if one's ego is built on a false doctrine, this doctrine, Jung states, will then formulate inner experiences. This is important, because if one is working on oneself, yet is living on a false belief, a false doctrine, a broken magnet, then one's not doing any true work. To truly get to the root matter of things, it requires the root reality of things, in which the ego must be open to and develop an understanding and knowledge toward. Jung continues, the secret is first and foremost in man, in his true self, which he does not know, but learns to know by experience of outward things. So, to know oneself, One must live oneself and allow that other to help along the way. This doctrine that is spoken of is not learned. The ego is not going out and reading books to learn it. It is taught through experience, in which there must be an ego. But this does not mean self-knowledge is ego knowledge. Again, it is of the arcane. The body of consciousness, the vessel of consciousness, is the ego. If one only knows that part of oneself, they're missing the whole picture. The knowledge we are speaking of here is the true knowledge of one's own essence. Expanding on this, Jung adds, since knowledge of the world dwells in his own bosom, the adept should draw such knowledge of himself, for the self he must seek to know is a part of that nature which was bodied forth from God's original oneness with the world. It is manifestly not a knowledge of the nature of the ego, though this is far more convenient and is fondly confused with self-knowledge. The other, on the contrary, is a difficult and morally exacting study of which so-called psychology knows nothing, and the educated public very little. The alchemist, however, had at very least an indirect inkling of it. He knew definitely that as a part of the whole, he had an image of the whole in himself, the firmament, or Olympus, as Paracelsus calls it. The interior microcosm was the unwitting object of alchemical research. Today, we would call it the collective unconscious, and we would describe it as objective because it is identical in all individuals and is therefore one. Out of this universal one, there is produced in every individual of subjective consciousness, i.e. ego. That is roughly how we would understand Dorn's formerly one and separated by a divine act of creation. Through this, you're really getting an understanding of this oneness, of this one that was spoken about earlier. And to understand it, I'll illustrate a drawing based off a sentence which reads, he knew definitely that as part of the whole, he had an image of the whole in himself. The one, the prima materia, then creates an image of itself. This self, with an ego as its body, is us. And while we create this world, say through a thought, belief, traumatic memory, and the like, we then trap a part of ourself, a part of that essence, in it. And it is a returning back to that essence, which can help us bring back the parts of our broken soul to its original source. The ego is in a tricky, paradoxical position of attracting, experiencing, developing through the work, yet remaining out of the way. On this, Jung continues, man knows only a small part of his psyche, just as he has only a very limited knowledge of the physiology of his body. The causal factors determining his psychic existence reside largely in unconscious processes outside consciousness, and in the same way there are final factors at work in him which likewise originate in the unconscious. Freud's psychology gives elementary proof of the causal factors, Adler's of the final ones. Causes and ends thus transcend consciousness to a degree that ought not to be underestimated, and this implies that their nature and actions are unalterable and irreversible so long as they have not become objects of consciousness. They can only be corrected through conscious insight and moral determination, which is why self-knowledge, being so necessary, is feared so much. Now, why is self-knowledge so feared? Because most fear looking into their own shadows, let alone accepting a part of oneself that transcends time and has a power and intelligence. This is a rather shift in life perception. The most important thing of all is the ego determined morally to experience and develop through the work. And it is only in the ego, the conscious vessel, in which any unconscious correction can take place. Hence its importance, and the reason why one must bear wholeness. On this ego-self relationship, Jung provides his own psychological interpretation over a theological text. Accordingly, if we divest the opening sentence of the foundation of its theological terminology, it would run as follows. Man's consciousness was created to the end that it may recognize its descent from a higher unity, pay due and careful regard to this source, execute its commands intelligently and responsibly, and thereby afford the psyche as a whole the optimum degree of life and development. To wrap it all up, man's consciousness was created to the end that it may, one can say, individuate. And to individuate, one must realize it must be done through oneself. As Jung continues on the ego and self relationship, indeed, it is in need of help and must be perceived, protected, and as it were built up by the conscious mind, just as if it did not exist at all, and were being called into being only through man's care and devotion. As against this, we know from experience that it had long been there, and is older than the ego, and that it is actually the spiritus rector of our fate. The self does not become conscious by itself, but has always been taught, if at all, through a tradition of knowing. This is a powerful quote and beautifully outlines the alchemical process and individuation. Without an experiencing ego, say oneself has become inflated, the self can never come to know itself, as it has nothing to know itself through. And while the self needs the ego to become known, the ego must be able to conceive what is attempting to come through. As Jung adds, for without the existence of conscious concepts, apprehension is, as we know, impossible. This explains numerous neurotic disturbances which arise from the fact that certain contents are constellated in the unconscious but cannot be assimilated owing to the lack of apperceptive concepts that would grasp them. This is why it is extremely important to tell children fairy tales and legends and religious ideas, dogmas, into grown-ups, because these things are instrumental symbols with whose help unconscious contents can be canalized into consciousness, interpreted, and integrated. Failing this, their energy flows off into conscious contents which normally are not much emphasized, and intensifies them to pathological proportions. We then get apparently groundless phobias and obsessions, crazes, idiosyncrasies, hypochondriatic ideas, and intellectual provisions suitably camouflaged in social, religious, or political garb. We could see how parts of us can get trapped into these garbs and all kinds of pathologies if we're not aware of its true source. And it is solely rooted in one's own ego's ignorance that allows these pathologies and garbs to become. Again, everything comes back to you. This is also an important note for parents, as you can see how these myths contain psychological value. Through this, we see the center is not in one's ego, but rather outside it. As Jung furthers, for the alchemist, it was clear that the center, or what we would call the self, does not lie in the ego, but outside it, in us, yet not in our mind, being located rather in that which we unconsciously are, the quid, which we still have to recognize. Today, we would call it the unconscious, and we distinguish between a personal unconscious, which enables us to recognize the shadow, and an impersonal unconscious, which enables us to recognize the archetypal symbol of the self. You see, the center of one's psyche is not in consciousness. It's outside conscious awareness, but it's still in us. On this paradox, Jung writes, no one can produce anything without an object that is like him, but it is like him because it comes from that same source. If he wants to produce the incorruptible medicament, he can only do so in something that is inclined to his own center, And this is the center in the earth and in all creatures. It comes, like his own, from the same fountainhead, which is God. Separation of apparently dissimilar things, such as heaven, the elements, man, etc., was necessary only for the work of generation. Everything separated must be again united in the production of the stone, so that the original state of unity shall be restored. But, says Dorn, thou wilt never make from others the one which thou seekest, except first there be made one thing of thyself. The union of opposites in the stone is possible only when the adept has become one himself. The unity of the stone is equivalent to individuation, by which man is made one. We would say that the stone is a projection of the unified self. This formulation is psychologically correct. You see everything we've broken down at play here. Again, no one can produce anything without an object that is like him, of its same essence. And the conscious and unconscious must become one before the stone is produced. It must be produced out of one's own nature. This refers to a state of being, when the unconscious and conscious are in union. One must be before they become, or in this chapter's metaphor, one must be before they can create the lapis philosophorum. Jung continues and adds, this is why the theoria and arcane in matter are both called the veritas. This truth shines in us, but is not of us. It is to be sought not in us, but in the image of God which is in us. You see, the magnet holds this universal truth, and the prima materia contains a part of its truth, and the stone is this truth waking up, the unconscious, becoming conscious. The truth shines in us, but is not of us. A statement that many should meditate on today. There is a universal truth, regardless of your petty wants and opinions. And you see how this is a bit different than the law of attraction we see in books like The Secret. We're not attracting what we think we need, but we're attracting what our self needs. Now, Jung reaches the conclusion of this chapter with one more reference to Dorn. Dorn thus equates the transcendent center in man with the God image. Indeed, Dorn goes even further and allows the predicate of being to this truth, and to this truth alone. Further, that we may give a satisfactory definition of the truth, we say it is. But nothing can be added to it. For what, pray, can be added to the one? What is lacking to it? Or on what can it be supported? For in truth, nothing exists besides that one. The only thing that truly exists for him is the transcendental self, which is identical with God. And for those who are familiar with my lecture series or the Red Book, Jung titles his first chapter, The Way of What Is to Come. And for Dorn, this truth is what is. We have reached the end of the chapter, and a lot has been covered. I was going to provide interpretation on this original text that we started with, but it seems to be wise to just read it and leave it to you to interpret. The alchemical text reads, "For that which we take, in order to prepare from it the philosophical work, is naught else but that little fish, the Echeneis, which has no blood or spiny bones, and is shut up in that deep mid-region of the great universal sea. This little fish is extremely small, alone, and unique in its shape. But the sea is great and vast, and hence it is impossible for those to catch it who do not know in what part of the world it dwells. Believe me verily, that he who, as Theophrastus says, does not well understand the art by which he can draw down the moon from the sky and bring it from heaven to earth, and change it into water and then into earth will never find the material of the stone of the wise, for it is not more difficult to perform the one than to find the other. Yet, nonetheless, when we speak somewhat in confidence in the ear of a trusted friend, we teach him that hidden secret of the wise, how he can naturally, speedily, and easily catch the little fish called remora, which is able to hold back the proud vessels of the great ocean sea, that is the spirit of the world. Those who are not sons of the art are altogether ignorant, and know not those precious treasures which are concealed by nature in the precious and heavenly aquavitae of our sea. But that I may declare to you the clear light of our unique material, or our virgin soil, and teach you in what wise you may acquire the supreme art of the sons of wisdom, it is needful that I instruct you concerning the magnet of the wise, which has the power of attracting the little fish called Echeneis or remora from out the center and depth of the sea. If it is caught in accordance with nature, it changes in a natural way, first into water and then into earth. And this, when properly prepared by the cunning secret of the wise, has the power of dissolving all solid bodies and making them volatile, and of purifying all bodies that are poisoned. This art, this work, is both transformative and healing, and thus is Jungian individuation. And to conclude, I want to add libido into this mix. As much of it has been intelligence and logos, it is, in my opinion, the psychological function of libido which is driving the attraction. If one is the common magnet with its worldly doctrine, its desires will desire like nature. Now, if one introverts their libido, then you could see how one is opening up to the unconscious and is now attracting what is needed for its own self. And with that, I believe I exhausted this chapter in Aion. I hope this information stimulated your psyche and your unconscious towards higher levels of awareness. It is filled with many symbols as well as essence, so take your time to grasp any concepts that you cannot yet see. If you have any questions, please feel free to comment or send an email, which you may find on my channel. I truly appreciate you for taking the time to watch this lecture. Please share this material with anyone who would enjoy this deep dive into Jung and the self, and I look forward to our next time together in the next video. Until then, stay humble.